Hello, and welcome once again to the Just and Sinner podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. And I just want to give everybody a reminder, like we always do, that Just and Sinner is a donor-supported organization. So if you'd like to see the materials that we produce continue, if you have appreciated our educational content, we just ask that you would consider becoming a contributor. You can give a one-time gift, or you can become a regular contributor to continue to help us out on a continual basis. So go to justandsinner.org, go to our donate page there, and see how it is that you can help us out. So on the program today, we are going to be continuing our series where we are looking at some late medieval thinkers, and this isn't where we started with our Makers in the Modern World series, but I'm now adding these kind of precursors to modernity within this series. So we'll be talking today about William of Ockham and the rise of late medieval nominalism. Ockham is really the central figure for late medieval nominalism. We'll talk a bit about what Ockham taught and his influence as we continue through this series. Now, I do want to make one quick comment about the prior video to this. And in the last video, we talked about John Duns Scotus. John Duns Scotus is one of the most influential figures within the entirety of medieval scholasticism. And Scotus is a figure who has a number of different interpretations. Now, I'm not an expert in Scotus by any means. My own reading and my own system of thought is much more familiar with Thomas Aquinas' categories than Scotus' categories. And so I received some comments on the Scotus video about the way that he was portrayed in certain particulars that I just want to make mention of really quick before we jump into William of Ockham. And that is that there was a criticism from somebody who knows Scotus and Scotus scholarship much better than I do about Scotus' concept of univocity, because I made the claim that for Scotus, when being is then connected to another concept, such as goodness, that this no longer is a univocal concept. And so I just want to give you a citation of where I got that from to show you that I'm not just getting this out of nowhere. And this is a book called An Introduction to Medieval Theology. The author is Rick van Nieuwenhove, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. This is a book that I found very helpful. I've read through it a number of times. I think it's a really helpful handbook on medieval theology and theologians in general. And I found him to be quite accurate in his descriptions of these various figures. So I'm trusting here his interpretation of Scotus. But he says this: "There is a common concept which can be affirmed of God and creatures. This concept is being, and it applies to everything that is not nothing, i.e. God and creatures. This is an empty, abstract, and contentless concept, and it can therefore be filled in radically different ways. The major difference Scotus identifies between finite or creaturely being and infinite or divine being. When the univocal concept of being is joined with another notion, e.g. goodness, the resulting notion only applies to God and therefore is not univocal anymore." So that's where I'm getting this from, just so you have some idea. I'm not just getting this out of nowhere. He cites Scotus in defense of this interpretation that he takes. So I'll leave that there for what it is. But let's talk about William of Ockham. Now, I will mention here, which I probably should be doing in a lot of these, the books that I am citing, the books that I am using as resources. I'm always using primary sources and secondary sources for all of these talks. So in terms of primary sources, I'm really relying on this one text, which is Ockham Philosophical Writings, and this is published by Hackett, edited by Philotheus Boehner, with a foreword by Stephen F. Brown. So really helpful volume. This contains a selection of Ockham's writings in English and in Latin on the other side. So helpful. And you can check the translation yourself if you know Latin, which is helpful. I am using this Introduction to Medieval Theology that I mentioned. Ulrich Linsley, Introduction to Scholastic Theology. This is one that I have been referencing. Another one is The Harvest of Medieval Theology. This will be particularly evident for the next talk that we do on Gabriel Biel by Heiko Obermann. Another is Philosophy and Theology in the Middle Ages by G.R. Evans. And then Jaroslav Pelikan's Reformation of the Church and Dogma, 1300 to 1700, which is part of Pelikan's Christian tradition, a history of the development of doctrine. So just so you know, this is where I'm getting a lot of this material from. These are the primary sources that I have been looking at as I've been preparing this, but mostly this comes from the philosophical writings directly from Ockham and from the foreword, which is a really helpful introduction to the thought of Ockham. So if you want to know Ockham, honestly, this forward is an introduction is helpful enough that you're going to get a pretty good idea of Ockham and his ideas, even just from the introduction. It's well worthwhile. All right, so let's then start talking about William of Ockham and exactly who William of Ockham was. Now, we're going to just set some context of what's going on here historically. The world has changed a lot at this point, and the world is changing. This is the pre-modern era, but there are a lot of historical circumstances that are leading to some of the questions that people like Ockham, and then later the humanists and the reformers are going to be asking, and the issues that they are going to be addressing. So we have the beginning here of what are European nation states. And so we have an increased sense of a kind of national identity, and this really begins in the 14th century, and then that sense of national identity really continues, and you don't really even see the full flourishing of that until the late 18th century. But you have this clearer identity between people and the places that they live, in particular, the assertion of the rights of monarchs. Now, there's a battle that's going to occur between monarchs and the papacy. There's a battle for power in the late medieval world. So there's a power struggle, particularly that's relevant to Ockham's life, between the French monarch, Philip the Fair, and then Pope Boniface, and we're looking at the years 1294 to 1303. Now, Philip asserts power over the church as the magistrate, the church in France, and Pope Boniface demands the submission of earthly rulers to the papal office. This is going to lead to a number of political treatises talking about issues of the temporal authority of the Pope and the temporal authority of the church, and also the role of the civil magistrate in deciding religious matters. These debates are not going to be resolved in the medieval period. These are debates that really are still in some ways being waged today. But it really begins during this era. So this leads to what is called often the Babylonian captivity of the popes, or the Avignon papacy. So during this political battle, the papacy is moved from Rome to Avignon in France. So the Avignon papacy, the years are 1309 to now 1376. This eventually is going to lead to the great, papal schism, where you have multiple popes that are appointed. You have at one point 3 papal claimants, and then they're all kind of overturned, and there is another pope that is placed in that position. Now, that's past the time of William of Ockham's life, but that is relevant context if we're going to be understanding the kinds of questions about things like authority that people in this era are asking. And so there is a loss of papal power in a lot of ways here politically, but also on behalf of the laity, there is a growing distrust of the office of the papacy, and you understand why this would be the case with this kind of turmoil happening. Then you also have the rise of something called conciliarism. Now, there's this ongoing debate within the Roman Church between the conciliarists, who assert that it is the councils who are the primary source of authority in the church, and then the strong papalists, who are going to argue that the authority of the councils is really derived from the Pope affirming those councils. If you want to see more about that, you can look at my series that I've done on Vatican I in the 19th century, when this kind of debate comes to height, and then it doesn't really end, but in some ways it seems to find a conclusion within the dogma of papal infallibility. But then Vatican II actually kind of moves in a more conciliar direction. So these tendencies remain today within the Roman Communion. Okay, there is an increase in writing in the vernacular. And so most people still are not literate at this time, but people are beginning to read a bit more. There is an increase in literature at this time. I mentioned Chaucer, who's in the 14th century here. There is also a growth of spiritual writings. And the growth of spiritual writings, I mentioned a few names here: Meister Eckhart, John Tauler, Henry Suso. There is an increased divorce or divide between the more mystical writings, the more mystical or practical spiritual elements of theology, and scholastic theology. So in earlier scholastic theology, you don't get so much this divide between the academic and the practical, but you do start to see this increase during the late medieval scholastic era, where you have the mystics and then you have the scholastics as kind of two very distinct ways of approaching theology. There is a continual move away from Aristotle. We talked about this a little bit last time with Duns Scotus, how there was a lot of skepticism about the use of Aristotle in theology, and the church in many ways moves away from Thomism, though there is still always a remaining Thomistic school even at this time. So this is all important context to understand a little bit of what's going on in this era to grasp what Ockham is doing and what he is speaking to. So Ockham's years are approximately 1288 to 1348. He is born in Surrey, England. He joins the Franciscans. We talked about before how Scotus is a Franciscan. Scotism becomes in many ways kind of the official position philosophically of the Franciscans for at least a period of time. He studies in London and Oxford sometime around 1310. Now, you see a lot of this is very approximate. Just like in Scotus, we don't really have a lot of details about Ockham's life, so we're kind of filling in the gaps from the little pieces of things that we do seem to grasp at different points. He is actually accused of heresy in 1323, and because of that, he is called to Avignon to the papal court in 1324. Now, Occam is never officially condemned for heresy, and that's not just true in this era, that's also true later. And so where we later have, after the Reformation, this extensive list of these banned books that the Roman Church does not want people to read, Occam doesn't make that list. The nominalists as a whole don't generally tend to make that list, which I think is significant, but we'll talk about that in another talk where we look at some of the Roman responses to nominalism after the Reformation. Ockham eventually accuses Pope John XXII of heresy, and this is over these debates about the Franciscan commitment to poverty. We're not going to get into that in this talk, so it's not particularly relevant, but it's worth noting in Ockham's life. Now, Ockham dies somewhere around 60 years old. It's often posited that it was likely that it was due to the Black Death. We have no idea, but there are a lot of deaths. Everybody's dying from the Black Death at this point, so it's likely that that's the case, but we don't definitively know that. That's kind of all we have about Ockham's life. It's very little, so we don't really know very much. We mostly know him, just like Scotus, from his writings. Now, Ockham's writings are generally going to be divided into three different categories. Actually, often they're going to be divided into two, which is the theological and philosophical, and then the political. But I think we really need to divide these into really three categories instead of two. The theological writings, first is the commentary on the sentences. All of the writers we're going to be looking at during this era have a commentary on the sentences. That's just when people do their most intense theological work. And so the sentences is a work of a theologian named Peter Lombard, which is the standard dogmatics textbook of the late medieval period. And so this becomes the book that everybody else lectures on, and when they lecture on this, then they develop really their own theological systems. It becomes more of a backdrop for their own ideas rather than just an exposition of what Lombard meant in this text. Even Lombard's text isn't really so much Lombard as it is Augustine and a number of other authors that he's really compiling here. And you see the same kind of thing happening after the Reformation with Melanchthon's Loci. You know, people just lecture on it, and then those lectures become texts in and of themselves. Then we have the 7 quadlibets or disputations. This is 1322 to 1325. This covers a number of different theological issues. His philosophical writings, exposition of Aristotle's categories, sometime between 1321 and 24, an exposition of Aristotle's physics, sometime between 1322 and 24. He has a treatise on predestination and grace, 1321 to 1324, and a Summa of Logic, which is 1323 to 1325. The logic is going to be really central to understanding Occam. In many ways, Occam is really a thinker that is devoted far more to logic than just about anything else. We see this move really from metaphysics to logic. In a way, we may even say that he's kind of a precursor to analytic philosophy in that sense, though maybe that's overstating things a little bit. He's not working from an analytic framework, obviously. But he also has political writings because he's engaged in these political disputations about the powers of the papacy. The Work of 90 Days, 1332 to 1334, a dialogue, 1334 to 46, and then 8 questions on the power of the Pope, 1340 to 41. Now, his political writings are really important, but we're really not going to delve into that. We're going to look more at his philosophy and his system of thinking rather than those issues. That would have to be another talk. So Ockham is, of the late medieval thinkers, the first that introduces nominalism in a really influential way. We have nominalists before Ockham, certainly, but Scotus is moving the conversation away from universals toward particulars. Now, if you don't know what that is, I really would urge you to listen to the video before this or watch the video before this, listen to the podcast, whatever, because I don't want to re-explain all of this, but Ockham ends up denying the strong Platonic realism where the universals or the forms have a real existence. He also then is going to reject a more Thomistic realism, which depends more so on Aristotle. And then he is also going to reject a Scotian realism, which focuses much more strongly on the particular than these other forms of realism. So Scotian realism is the most moderated form of realism. And we have this idea of hexeity, where there's this kind of individuation, there is this focus on individual things that doesn't deny the universal, but Ockham is now going to essentially reject this idea of hexeity altogether and say that we don't really need universals as a distinct metaphysical category. There aren't universals as something that is at least real. Okay, he's been called the Doctor Invincibilis for his unwavering stance in support of nominalism. And so he's very bold in his nominalist stance. He is probably the clearest and best expositor, defender of nominalism during the medieval period. I mean, Ockham is quite a brilliant thinker, and he has some pretty significant arguments that are well formed and well laid out. So again, he's not the first nominalist, but he's really the most influential in this era, and he has a profound impact on the thinkers that follow him. Gabriel Biel is going to be the most significant one that we're going to look at, though he influenced all sorts of other thinkers as well, including non-nominalists, too, to be clear. So it's not like Ockham's influence is only on the nominalists. He's influential in a variety of different ways. He uses terms like fictiones, or fiction, signa mentalia, mental signs, or nomina, names, or signa verbalia, verbal signs, to refer to universals. It's just to say that there are all different ways that he refers to universals, but they are not real, and that's pretty evident. Now, his view can be referred to either as nominalism or conceptualism. Those terms aren't exactly identical, but it depends on who's using the term, because sometimes they kind of are. And Ockham actually seems to change his view toward a more conceptualist view later in life. Nominalism, the word simply means that universals, the universal categories that we use to describe or categorize things, are just names. They don't have any real existence. Conceptualism says that they are mental concepts. So they might be real in a sense conceptually in our minds, but they don't have any actual real existence outside of the human intellect. And so we might have kind of shared concepts in some way that are something kind of like universals, but they don't really have an essence or existence in themselves, even in something like the mind of God. So for Ockham, universal terms or words that we use to describe things are both mental and linguistic identifiers, but they don't have any inherent existence outside of human cognition. And so he's going to reject notions of divine ideas. And so he's going to reject this idea that there are these divine eternal ideas, which are the universals, which things in this world participate in. So in a classical view, you might say that there is an idea in the mind of God that is humanity or human nature. And when any individual human is created, those human beings are partaking in that divine idea. They're sharing in that divine idea. So human as a category is something that is real, and it is something that is real in the mind of God. So he rejects that in its Platonic form, but he also rejects the view of Aquinas would be that there is a sense in which divine ideas are exemplar causes. So Ockham contends that the creation of matter that comes out of ideas in these more classical views is not really a creation ex nihilo. And so essentially what Ockham says is, if God is going to, say, create human beings, right? He creates Adam and Eve. If the first thing that happens is God has this kind of idea of what humanness is, and then he creates the individual human beings out of a pre-existent idea within the mind of God. Well, then human beings aren't really created out of nothing, they're created out of ideas. This is going to be his argument. And so he's going to say that if we really have a creation out of nothing, this kind of necessitates that we have some kind of direct creation that must not include these ideas as mediating in any sense. As I said, Aquinas has this idea of the divine ideas as these exemplar causes, for example. So Ockham would reject that outright. Well, this leads to a lot of questions. Okay, if there's no shared nature of, say, humanity as our example here, then what is it that individuals actually have in common? Or is there anything even shared between individual human beings at all? And so he's going to say, Ockham is going to say that what they have in common is not some third thing in which they both participate. And so he's going to say, essentially, if you say, what's the commonality between person A and person B, Ockham is going to say, you don't have to introduce this third thing that is some kind of nature that's kind of floating out there to which person A and B aligns to say that they are similar to one another. And essentially he just says, well, they have similitude. They just have similarities. They seem to be alike in various ways, but they can do that as particulars without sharing in some third kind of universal essence or thing. Now, Ockham, as I mentioned before, has two distinct theories of universals, and so he moves from one view to the other. And this is pretty, as far as I can tell at least, and looking at secondary literature, it seems like this is pretty universally recognized. And that is in the earlier writings, he sees the universals as really fictive categories. They don't really exist. They're basically just a fiction when you say things like a human nature. It means nothing, really. It's just kind of a name. But in his later writings, he moves away from that kind of fictive approach, and he instead says, well, it's a cognitive category. And he says that when you're thinking about universals, what you're really doing is thinking about many things at once. So if you think about, say, human nature, what you're really doing is not thinking of some abstraction from particulars that has real existence. Instead, you're just thinking about all of the human beings that you know and have met, and you're thinking about them all at once in some way. There are some issues with this, and there are arguments against this that I really want to get into, but that's not the point of this video, so I'm not going to do that as much as I want to. Okay, so he's going to say God's cognition, or God's knowledge, is direct, not mediated by ideas. If creation is not mediated by these divine ideas, then this should also be applied to human cognition, so that just as God is not mediating his work by means of these eternal ideas, so does the human mind not mediate its knowledge. It doesn't need to mediate its knowledge through some universal abstraction. So Occam's epistemology then, and epistemology means how you know things. So we're saying, what is then Occam's idea of knowledge? Because he's already moved to that question of cognition and how these universal categories relate to particular things, and how he sees universals essentially as thinking about a bunch of particulars all at once. Now, this is a problem that nominalism has in general, is the problem of cognition. And I think we're going to see that as nominalism develops within the modern world, if you start looking at some later nominalist thinkers, which is really the majority of modern philosophy, we have a lot of questions about how people can know anything about the world at all. Now, Occam doesn't see all of these problems, and Occam is not wondering how we know anything or doubting that we would know anything. But I think an argument can be made, and I think rightly made, that the nominalist position is going to really necessitate that, so that the move that Occam makes isn't going to see its kind of consistent fruit until much later. Again, I don't want to do the thing, as I've said, where you just blame one idea or one person for all of the ills of modern society and do that kind of thing. So I'm not trying to do that, but I do think that there is a place to say that ideas have consequences, and Occam doesn't really see the consequences of the ideas that he sets forth here. So in a realist approach, universals provide this cognitive unity between individual minds, as well as between the mental life and the external world. So let me just explain that a little bit. So if it is the case that say, triangularity is a universal thing, it's real, and that when my mind grasps triangularity, when I see something as triangular, what that means is that when someone else sees something as triangular and thinks about triangularity, we are thinking about the same thing because triangularity is real. So I know that there is an object that is grasped by my intellect that is also grasped by the other person's intellect, that is a kind of abstraction toward the universal that we share in. So I can trust generally that someone else knows what I'm talking about, that there's a unity between my mind and someone else's mind, because we're all sharing these same universal ideas. There also is this unity between what is in my mind and what is in the world, what the world actually is in itself. So if, say, something that is triangular shares in the notion of triangularity, right? Say I'm playing The Legend of Zelda, right? And you have the Triforce, and the Triforce is triangular. So when I look at the Triforce, that's a triangular object, and my mind understands triangularity because it is a real thing or a real idea, a universal, that the triangular object, the Triforce, participates in, that my mind also grasps and participates in. What this means is that there is something that unites my intellect to the world as it is in itself. When you get rid of universals, now you have this problem of how do I know anything in the world at all, because there isn't this uniting kind of force of these universal ideas that the world participates in, that my intellect also participates in. This is the constant issue with nominalism. And so nominalists have to deal with this problem. So Ockham arrives at the opposite position in considering these things that St. Thomas Aquinas does. And so what he says is, well, particulars are the thing that we just encounter all the time. We don't need universals. It's not like we have to wonder about how it is that we have particulars when like that's the thing that you encounter. When you encounter a person, you don't encounter a human nature in the abstract, you just encounter a person, right? So why do we need to create this problem of the universal and the particular when what we really encounter in daily life is just particular people, particular objects, particular things? So let's talk just briefly to summarize what Thomas Aquinas says. Now this is brief and not comprehensive at all, so I'm trying to do the best I can in a very short way. So essentially what Thomas Aquinas says is that when the individual encounters any kind of object, the individual receives what he calls the sensible species of the thing through this cognitive power, this mental power that's called fantasia. All right, so that is essentially to say that when you encounter something with your senses, right? If I encounter the desk that I'm sitting at, I can look down at the desk and through fantasia, I'm going to receive the sensible species. What that means is the senses, the things that impact my senses. So the feel, the color of the thing, the texture, whatever. These are things that I am receiving in my senses. Now, I am able to, this is kind of an amazing thing, that we're able not only to have disparate senses that have disparate experiences in these very different things, right? So smell is very different from taste, is very different from touch, is very different from sight, is very different from hearing. But when we encounter one object, say that we might smell and taste and see all at the same time, that we don't have to process that as a bunch of separate sensations. Instead, we experience that as one coherent thing that we receive by totally different senses. And there's an argument to be made even for the existence of an immaterial intellect that is really the only possible way to explain how it is that sensible things are perceived as whole things, rather than just as a series of various sense experiences. But set that aside for now. The point is, we receive this sensible species, which is through sense experience, through fantasia. And what the intellect then does is abstract universals from these kind of mental images that we gather through the senses. And then through the intellect, the intelligible species is now grasped, which is not just the senses, but the thing as it is, the universal thing. Okay, so when I say I look at and feel the desk, these are, I receive the sensible species. I have, through my senses, experienced something of sight and touch. But then the intellect immediately grabs onto this intelligible species and knows the object as it is. Now, this all happens immediately, so this isn't like a process, obviously. None of this is a conscious process. But Thomas is just talking about how it is that we have these experiences with our senses that we immediately recognize as these categories or universals. So what we see is then that there is this natural abstraction that happens anytime we encounter a particular through the senses to the intellectual, to the grasping of the intelligible species. All of that is background to say that Ockham is going to reject this entire system, and he wants something that is much simpler. And that's a principle of Ockham's. This is Ockham's razor, what he's most well known for. But it's a principle of Ockham's philosophy, is that he wants to simplify things as much as he possibly can. So for knowledge for Ockham is largely about propositions. So really talking, when you know something, you know a proposition. You are not coming to know an essence. You're not coming to know triangularity, because there is no real essence of triangularity. He's going to say that we know things or objects, particulars, by intuition. Now, by intuition, he doesn't mean what we tend to mean when we use the word intuition. What he's talking about is something that occurs through our sense experience. And so what he's saying is that as you encounter a particular object, through your experience, you have this intuitive knowledge of what a thing is, because you've seen it, you've viewed it with your own eyes, you've touched it, whatever. So intuition is still in the intellect, in other words. And by intuition, we don't just mean, inner impulses in your heart or something like, you intuit that something might be the case. He's talking about an intuition that is certain, really, because it's gathered through the experiences of the senses. Ockham departs from the medieval view that signification, when we use words or concepts to signify things, is determined by thoughts. Okay, in other words, a word is defined by the thought to which it points. So if we're talking again about triangularity, for someone like Thomas, and we're talking about triangularity, what does that signify? What does that verbal utterance signify? Is going to say that it signifies a universal idea or concept that is within the intellect, that I share in my intellect with you, who also grasps this in the intellect. And Ockham is going to say that words generally are going to identify objects in the world. It's a bit more complicated than that, but generally he's going to say that words identify objects. So they identify particulars. So when I say triangle, I'm identifying a particular thing. That is a triangle that I might experience, or several triangles at once, as he would say. This means that language does not convey what is in one mind to another mind, which is what I said you're missing when you go into a nominalist framework. But instead, language is really a dispenser of information through propositions. Okay. Now, Ockham's theory of logic, as I said, is really his most probably central idea or set of ideas. But we can't really get into all of it here because it's pretty complex. It's not the easiest thing in the world to understand. So I'm just going to hit some key points on this. There is a hierarchy of signification for Ockham. And so Ockham's going to say that writing is subordinate to speech, and then speech is subordinate to concepts. Now, when people are talking about logic in the medieval world, they generally are thinking about speech. And that's really important to keep in mind as you read about logic in the medieval period, because we tend to think that that's probably not the case. We prioritize writing more so than they did at that time. So this can be a bit confusing sometimes. So he does believe concepts are important, right? He's saying that speech, even as important as speech is subordinate to concepts. So he's going to say that concepts, they're not real metaphysically. They don't have real existence. They do have a kind of stability. And so concepts have a kind of stability that words do not. And so, for example, the word dog is really arbitrary, that we use that word to refer to an animal, a particular animal. And that word may change. It may change because of human choice. It may change because language develops. It may change just because you're speaking in a different language, which has a different word. But the concept that you're trying to identify underneath that does not change in the same way. And so whether you're speaking, say, English or Spanish or Japanese, and you're using the word for dog in all three of those languages, the word for dog is totally different. but the concept is still united between all of those languages. So there is a kind of universality in these cognitive concepts then, but that's only within the realm of the human intellect. All right, so to get more specifically into his logic now, he's going to say that there are really three parts of logic. The first is terms. These are the words that you're using, right? Then you have propositions, which are made up of those terms, and then you have reasoning, which is based on an evaluation of various propositions. So the elements of propositions are terms. And so terms are the most basic component of logic. Terms serve the purpose of signification. And so when you are using a word, you are trying to signify something with the words that you use. Language is, in some sense, Ockham is going to say artificial. And that's just pointing back to the example that I used, that there is a kind of arbitrariness to the exact words that we use to identify things. You can watch my video on Saussure for a more modern take on some of these same kinds of issues, who has some similar conclusions to what Ockham is saying here. Language points to concepts. Again, concepts are the most essential for Ockham, which are natural signs. This is his language. He refers to them as natural signs, which result directly from the encounter that occurs between the object and the intellect. So if I encounter something that is triangular, now I have this concept of triangularity, which is a natural sign because it's derived from a direct experience that I have with a triangular object. And so we have natural signs and artificial signs. So artificial signs are the words that we use. So there's a natural sign when I get the idea of triangularity because I see a triangle in nature, some form or another. That's natural because it's derived from nature. But then there's an artificial sign to refer to the concept because the word triangle is a made-up word, and triangle as a word doesn't derive from the direct experience of the object itself. It's simply a category that we use to refer to the thing. There's a distinction that then Ockham makes between categorematic and syncategorematic terms. So the former, this is the categorematic terms, refer to those words which signify objects directly. So a cat or a man or an apple would be examples of this. The latter of these, the syncategorematic terms, refer to words which only make sense in relation to other objects. So these are things that we only grasp, we can only make sense of if we understand other objects. But they do not themselves identify objects. So it's just some words like every, only, is not. What if you just use the word every is not pointing to an object directly. That makes no sense. So every what? If you say every cat is black, well, that wouldn't be a right statement, but what you're trying to say is at least comprehensible to the intellect. But if you just say the word every, it doesn't make sense. But if you say the word cat, you have a more clear objective identifier than you would with the word every. Okay, so these are syncategorematic terms. Okay, and then we've got this distinction between the absolute and connotative senses of these categorematic terms. So categorematic terms can be divided into those which are absolute and then those which are connotative. Absolute terms identify objects directly. So that would be, I give just some more examples, similar things that we just talked about, a woman or a dog or a tree. Okay. Connotative terms identify something directly and then something else indirectly. Okay. So what do we mean by this? Well, let's look at the examples here. The color, shape, or texture of an object. So you could think about something like, say, the color white. But when you think of the color white, you can't just think of the color white as an abstract thing, because you're thinking of a white something. Even if you're thinking about a white piece of paper or a white screen or a white piece of clothing, so white exists as it's instantiated in particular objects. So these are, again, connotative terms. So it doesn't have the same directness, right? If you're talking, say, about a dog, say you're talking about a white dog. Well, the word dog is pretty particular. You could point to an object and say, that's the dog. Now, the term white is only makes sense relative to the object of the dog that you are identifying as white. Okay. So connotative terms are inherently composite. They're a combination of various concepts together. Okay, suppositio. Now, suppositio is something that shows up in a number of late medieval thinkers, and it doesn't always mean the same thing. This is pretty confusing, to be honest. Speaking for myself, even reading these sources, and from what I can tell, the word suppositio just has a very broad range of meanings depending on who it is that you're reading. And so there isn't even an exact... there isn't even a singular interpretation of even what Ockham always means by suppositio, because sometimes he seems to use it in some different ways. So I'm going to try here. Terms, when they are abstracted from the objects that they identify, can become subjects of discourse themselves as suppositio. Okay, when discussing these terms, personal suppositio, that's the term that he uses here. The term is a kind of stand-in for the signified object. Okay, probably doesn't make sense yet, but hopefully when I give the example it will. This identifies true statements as opposed to false statements. This is one of the things that suppositio does. It does more than that too, but I'm just giving you one example for the sake of brevity here. So a true statement is one in which the subject and the predicate refer in some way to the same object. Okay. For example, if I said, this coffee is hot. I have coffee in this mug because I always have coffee on my desk. And so if I said, this coffee is hot, well, I've used the word coffee, the subject, and I've used the word hot, the predicate. The coffee is hot. But these are not identifying distinct objects. So when I say coffee, I'm identifying, well, the coffee. And when I say hot, I'm also identifying the coffee. I'm identifying something about the coffee, but I'm still identifying the same essential thing. And so, when I do that, when I use the word coffee and when I use the word hot, I am abstracting these concepts from the actual object itself for this phrase to even be comprehensible at all. Because if I'm not abstracting them, then what I'm saying is essentially nothing. I'm just saying this coffee is the coffee. Well, that doesn't make any sense. So what I'm doing is abstracting the terms that are elements of or ways that we understand, things that we understand about the coffee, and I'm subtracting them and treating them as if they are objects in and of themselves, if you understand what I'm saying here. Okay, so though coffee and heat are not identical concepts in themselves, they do both serve as stand-ins in some way for exactly or precisely the same concept or object. All right, that's essentially what we're doing with suppositio. Now, this is actually going to become an issue that is discussed in analytic philosophy when we're talking about things like, well, the morning star and the evening star, they're referring to the same thing. So if anyone follows analytic philosophy at all, if you're familiar with that, there's some similarity here with what Ockham is doing. Okay, now let's talk about ontological reduction, this reduction of being or beings, or the way that we could talk about being. Now we get to Occam's razor, the most famous thing that Ockham this is the thing that he's known for, which essentially is that which can be explained more simply should not be explained by multiplication or complexity. That's a summarization of what Ockham is saying. Now, the simplest explanation is always the best. It's kind of the way that this is often summarized in modern discourse. It's not quite accurate really to what Ockham is doing. I mean, Ockham is really talking specifically about metaphysics here. And so I understand why Occam's razor means what it does for people today, but it's a bit divorced from what he's really trying to do or what he's really using the statement for. So let's talk about what are these various categories that philosophers are using, because Ockham is trying to simplify his philosophy. He's trying to simplify the philosophy that's been received. And that's really inherent to his whole project, is he's trying to make things as simple as possible. So Aristotle has 10 different ontological categories into which essences and accidental properties fit, to which things fit. And those are substance, quantity, quality, relation, action, passion, place, time, position, habit. Now, this tenfold definition had been received by many of the scholastics in the medieval period. And I think it's a pretty good list, the 10 that Aristotle has here. And Ockham says this is way too complicated. It's far more complicated than it needs to be. And so we can actually take a lot of these terms and subsume them into other terms. A lot of them are essentially saying the same thing in a different way. And so Ockham reduces all ontological categories into just two. Okay, those are substance of a thing and a quality of the thing. So Ockham does acknowledge that the 10 categories of Aristotle aren't totally wrong, like they're linguistically or conceptually correct. So we understand that, say, quality and a relation or an action, these are different kinds of things in some sense. We can distinguish them intellectually, and there's a reason why we have different words to signify each of these kinds of things. And so they might be differentiated in language and in concept, but in actuality, we're really just talking about these two things. No matter what we're talking about, everything essentially boils down to these two things. Here's an example, right? So, for example, Ockham speaks about a relation, which is a distinct category for Aristotle, as one predicate which has two different signifiers. So, for example, if you say a father is a man who has a child, you're really connoting two substances or two objects. And that is the man who is the father and then the child. And so to talk about fatherhood as a relation, what you're really doing is just speaking about two objects. But you're kind of hierarchically ordering those objects. So you have kind of a primary referent that's being connoted here, which is the father, and a secondary, which is the child. So what he's going to say is there's no real third essential category of fatherhood that is necessary to explain such relations. Now, he's not going to deny the reality of fatherhood, but he's going to say that we don't need that as kind of this third thing that is participated in. It's simply a way to describe these two particular objects as they relate to one another. Okay, so he doesn't deny the reality of relations. He's not saying that there are no relations. He's not denying the reality of other ontological categories. But he's saying that, so there's a conceptual reality, but this must be subsumed really under what can be reduced to just these two. So Ockham, as I said in the talk on Scotus, Ockham has this move to particulars, and anytime you have a move to particulars, you also have a move toward empiricism. Empiricism both being the idea that our knowledge is gained not through abstract reasoning, but through our experiences with the world, through our sense experience. So Ockham is going to deny that we have knowledge of intrinsic causal relations. So he's going to say that there are causes and then there are effects of those causes, but these are ordering sequences observed through our sense experience. So he's going to say that we don't need to get behind essences or objects to speak about causality in the way that someone like Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas does, where Thomas is going to speak about how every object exists in both act and potency, meaning that there are things that there are potencies that are already enacted in any particular object. It's doing certain things, but there are also things that it can do that it's not doing. These are these potentialities. It has the potential to do something that it's not doing. So that potentiality then is enacted when, say, some other object activates that potentiality. So, for example, you could say that a rubber ball has the potentiality of being kicked and moving across the room when it's kicked, right? So that is something that exists within the object of the rubber ball, that it has that potentiality inherent within itself, that it can be kicked and move across the room. When, say, a child then kicks that ball, moves his foot, and hits the ball, and the ball then moves, that potentiality is being actualized for it to be kicked. So Thomas, from Aristotle, has this very complex way of understanding, and I think right, but of understanding how it is that causes and effects relate to one another. And Ockham wants to kind of just get rid of all of that. This is far more complicated than it needs to be, and everything boils down to particular objects that we observe through sense experience. So causality is really just one thing happens and then another thing happens. So these are just sequences. David Hume is going to pick this up again and move in a much more skeptical direction than Ockham, I think, at least intends to, though I think Hume's perspective is kind of necessitated by what Ockham is saying here. Okay, so what this constitutes here is a move in intellectual history away from the understanding of nature as it is in itself, what Kant is going to call the Ding an sich, the thing in itself, toward our experiences of nature through sense experience. Now, Ockham takes it for granted that experience identifies actual existent reality beyond the senses, and it can be trusted. And so Ockham is not saying that all we know is that we have an experience of a ball being kicked, that a kick then effectuates the motion of the ball. He's not going to say that, like, it's just my experience that I see and hear that, but it might not really happen, or I don't really know if that's the case. He takes it for granted that what you experience is real, like it corresponds to reality. So he's not going into a skeptical perspective from here, but those who rely on Occam's nominalism later are going to move towards skepticism, to say, well, if we can't really know what the world is in itself, we only know it through our sense experience, and there are no universal things that we can really grasp, and there is no inherent causal relation that we have access to, well, then how do we know that what we see actually extends beyond the senses, that it actually exists in itself, in the way that we seem to perceive it at the very least? Now, at this point, it must be said that it's really difficult to synthesize Occam's nominalism in the way that he frames it here, and his denial of real relations, with Trinitarian orthodoxy. Because we're talking about a Trinitarian theology, there must be some essence that is divinity that is shared by three persons. And if you're going to deny that relations are a real category, you at least have to define how it is that the three persons are distinct in a way that differs from someone like Thomas Aquinas, who's going to define the persons as relations. And this move already begins with Scotus, because he can't really define the persons as relations in the way that Thomas does either, not at least quite in the same way. But Occam poses a more significant problem here. It's also difficult to synthesize this with the Incarnation, because in the Incarnation, you have to, at least in a classical understanding of the Incarnation, you have to assert that there is such a thing as human nature, because that's the whole point of the Incarnation, is that there is such a thing that Jesus assumed that is human nature, that is a reality, that in his assumption of that nature has an impact on others who also share that nature. And this kind of language of Christ taking on one singular nature that then has an impact on the universal category of humanity through his assumption of that nature, this goes back to the earliest Christian writings. And so it implies a realism. And I don't think it really works without realism. But what Occam is going to have to do, essentially, is say that, well, like, why did God become man? Not because the second person of the Holy Trinity had to become man in order to redeem a universal nature that we share in. Instead, we're really speaking about something that is just divine determination. Well, God just determined, or he decided, that this was going to be the way that he would accomplish salvation for humanity, was through becoming man. So he's going to say that, he obviously has to say that the Incarnation is essentially a Christian, but you're cutting out the metaphysical necessity of the Incarnation, or the whole, like, this is the reason why Christian theologians have been so insistent that Christ had to take upon himself not just part of humanity, right? Not just a physical body, but had to contain within himself everything that is a human nature, a human will, a human soul, a human mind. And so this is a real significant problem for nominalism of any kind within a Christian approach, is that you have a really hard time synthesizing this with Christian theology. Okay, so then let's get to the subject now of faith and reason. How is it that faith and reason relate? Well, there is a problem here that is going to be a consistent problem for the nominalists. And we saw this actually to some extent even in Scotus, though he wasn't a nominalist. And the problem is, if particulars rather than universals are the fundamental element of reality, And particulars are known via intuition through the senses. We know them directly through our direct experience. Well, how do we know God then? How is knowledge of God possible? Because we don't know God intuitively. We don't know God in this same way that, I might know, I don't know, my kids or my wife. Like I encounter them and have experiences with them in person. They're in front of me. I don't have this kind of relation with God. So how is knowledge of God even possible at all? And some will say later, like Kant in some way, that we can't really know. Okay, so Ockham is going to say a theological judgment is made through an act of apprehension or perception, and judgment or assent in light of one's experience with theological matters, which he refers to as habitus or habit. And so we have a number of things that are going on when we're talking about theological judgments. So we have to apprehend what a doctrine is, we have to assent to it, and then there is also an element of personal experience or habit that forms our theology as well, though it can't be intuitive knowledge in precisely the same way that we're talking about with our sense experience. Judgment, if we're going to make a judgment, a theological judgment or any kind of judgment, we have to have some knowledge of the propositions which we are judging, either judging to be right or wrong. Judgments cannot occur based on sense perception alone. And so in order to judge something, we don't just have our sense experience, but we have to have some kind of propositional or intellectual knowledge. Now, all of this has to do with the way that he views knowledge and propositions in general, because as we've talked about his form of logic, he starts with the individual objects, and we start with the particular, but then we also have this propositional knowledge. Propositions are made of terms which reference objects. So all of these things go together. So we need to have a sense of abstraction, at least in the intellect, in some way, in order to make any kind of judgment or to do logic. There's a distinction between intuitive knowledge, as I've talked about already, and the intuitive knowledge is through sense experience, but it's still by means of the intellect. So I think you can really get this wrong. So I think that's important. It's still intellectual knowledge. And then abstract knowledge, as he's going to call it at times, and that is based on reason. But the reason is still based on the intuitive knowledge. So in this intuitive knowledge, we gather information, we understand concepts, and then we use words to identify those concepts. When we are doing logic or reasoning, what we are doing in our reasoning is evaluating concepts that are derived from objects. And this is this more kind of abstract or rational knowledge or evaluation of propositions, judgment. So these two different things, the intuitive knowledge and the abstract knowledge, always have to be distinguished, even when they're concerning the same object, and such as God here. Okay, and I just made a note that this dichotomy is very simplified here. There's a lot more to this, but this is for the purpose of trying to keep this within an hour, and it's not going to be because I'm looking at the time here. Okay, in earthly matters, we need to have intuitive knowledge. It's only intuitive knowledge that brings certainty. So our certainty really comes from our intuitive knowledge, our experiences with particular things. Okay, there is no normal intuitive knowledge of God for Ockham, but God can do this by means of God's absolute power. He certainly can miraculously give some kind of more direct intuitive knowledge. And in eternity, we're all going to have this intuitive knowledge of God, but not now. Ockham makes this very strong distinction between theology and faith. This is just part of the way that he views logic and propositions. So theology can be known purely as really propositional truth, or just the understanding of concepts and their relations. This all is part of what I've mentioned at the very beginning, that there is this increased divide between the scholastics and the mystics, because theology then becomes in some way divorced from faith or Christian experience. Ockham believes that theology can be known and understood even by one who does not have faith. Direct intuition of God, which is necessary for any kind of certainty, is direct intuition. This isn't a possibility eternally. It's an eternal possibility. But we can't have it here unless there's some kind of miraculous intervention. Ockham does at times speak about how many truths of the Christian faith seem to be kind of irrational. And those things which are irrational, he's not going to say you throw them out, but you essentially just adopt them on the basis of revelation alone. So when things don't seem to make sense, if the church has declared this to be the case, you accept it as it is, as an element of revelation. This doesn't mean that he believes inherent kind of contradiction or a two truths kind of theory, though he's accused of that at times. Now, as we're talking about faith and reason here, Ockham denies the traditional kind of causal arguments for God's existence, arguments from a first cause or a first mover, like Thomas Aquinas' famous five ways. Now, he does have an argument for God's existence, and so he thinks that there is an argument that can be made for the existence of God that is more based on conservation, the conservation of reality in existence rather than causality. In other words, everything that exists needs other things to keep them in existence, and there cannot be just an infinite number of conservatory interdependent objects. But this argument, he doesn't go into it too deeply either. It's not expounded as much as we would probably like him to have expounded on it. But it doesn't really prove monotheism. It doesn't really prove that there is the unicity of God, that there is a singular God, not multiple sources or somethings that conserve reality in existence. There might be multiple sources of conservation. And Ockham doesn't really have a good way to refute this. Thomas Aquinas' five ways do, but Ockham doesn't. So there is, as much as he's going to admit that there is a kind of natural theology in some way, the realm of natural theology is lessened very significantly. He's going to reject the idea, Ockham is, that faith is a science. Science is based on empirical observations. Faith is not. Faith is really precisely the opposite. Another point that's important to make here is that for Thomas Aquinas, there is a correlation between God's self-knowledge and theology, so that the principles of divine knowledge are derived from God by means of revelation and grasped by the intellect. And so this is a distinction that's often made between among theologians between archetypal and ectypal theology. Archetypal theology is God's own self-knowledge, and ectypal theology is a derived knowledge that is based upon God's self-knowledge, so that there is a sharing in divine knowledge in some reflected way by the intellect, which is the only way that we can actually know. And this is something that Ockham's just going to totally reject. He's going to reject this relation between divine knowledge and human knowledge and theology. And this is because he denies that there really is any there are any real divine ideas in this sense, and he's going to deny a real ontological participation. Okay, then let's talk briefly about his view of univocity here. We talked about this already with Duns Scotus. So he's going to say that there is at least one common concept that all things share in common, and that is being. But when he's talking about being, he's really saying that being is simply that something exists. And in the same way, he doesn't really have a sense of universals at all. He's going to say being is kind of the same way. Being is really a way to categorize a bunch of things rather than something that can be abstracted, that is universal. So like God and the rest of creation sharing being univocally is really just essentially him saying that when we use the word being, what we're doing is categorizing many things at once, which is the existence of individuals and the existence of God. So that's all he's really saying here. Our conception of God must arise from our experiences with creatures because we don't have that kind of direct and intuitive knowledge of God, as we've said. But it's not really by way of the kind of clear causality that Thomas Aquinas would say. More that we abstract concepts from our experience with particulars, and we form those concepts together to help us to have a concept of divine being or God. So, for example, our concept of God as the first being, okay, or just as not the, but first being. This, for example, corresponds to concepts like being and first, and these things are intuitively known. We do know these things from our experience. Like we do know that things have being or existence. There's no distinction, by the way, between essence and existence in Ockham here. That's Thomas's distinction. He rejects this totally. So, this book, it exists. It has being. And Okay, well, I'm taking that concept of being from this book and now applying that concept to God. Well, also, this is the first book of Ockham's writings that I bought. Okay, well, there you go. The concept of first and the concept of being I've taken from this book and now I'm applying them to God. That's what he's talking about with univocity here, which isn't really quite the same as what someone like Duns Scotus is doing. Okay, I have, this is a citation from Ockham on this. Notwithstanding, there is a concept thus common to every being, the name being is equivocal, for it is not in accordance with one concept that it is predicated of all its possible subjects taken in their significative function. Rather, to the name being, there correspond diverse concepts. So this, you understand what he's saying here, is that there really are, again, this is just a name or a concept that we're using to describe a bunch of different things. So we're not really speaking about being univocally in the fullest sense even, because it's not like there is an essence of being that all things share and that's alike. He also is he's a voluntarist, which should not be surprising. And voluntarism, coming from this word voluntas, will, there's a prioritization of the will specifically, because you can talk about voluntarism in terms of anthropology, philosophical or theological anthropology. We're talking here specifically about the nature of God himself. As we talk about Gabriel Biel, we'll do a little more with more anthropological voluntarism. But there is a distinction that is made, and this is a distinction in all these late medieval nominalists, and this comes from Scotus too, but not that Scotus is the first one to use it, but more in this way at least. So there's a distinction between God's absolute power and God's ordained power. And as we look at Gabriel Biel, his whole system is really dependent on this distinction. The distinction first shows up in Peter Lombard, the one who writes the sentences, the book everybody's lecturing on here. It's used by Thomas Aquinas and it's used by Duns Scotus. For Thomas Aquinas, God's absolute power is simply everything that God is able to do. So anything that God logically can do is God's absolute power. God's ordained power is as power as it is used to carry out his will. So there are things God cannot do. For example, God cannot sin, right? So that's beyond God's even absolute power because that's a contradiction in his nature. For Scotus, God's ordained power is God's work within the bounds of his created law, so the standards of law and justice that he has created within this world. God's absolute power is God's work that is outside of, and maybe even contrary to, but that merits much further explanation, his law. So God, by his absolute power, is not, for example, bound to, say, the laws of nature when God performs a miracle. So by God's ordained power, nature is generally functions in this or that way, but by God's absolute power, he can intervene and set those laws aside for a moment. Ockham adopts Scotus's view here, and he contends that God's ordained power can change even with the removal or replacement of a moral law. Now, this is often cited within issues of ethics, where Ockham makes the argument that what is good and right, morally, is good and right because God has declared it to be so. And so he's going to say that, for example, the moral law, say things like the prohibition of lying, that this prohibition against lying is something that God has just decreed to be the case, but it could have been otherwise. In other words, God could have theoretically determined that lying was virtuous, that lying was a right thing to do, and that God desired his creatures to lie, but he chose to do otherwise. The critique of this is going to be that this is arbitrary. Now, defenders of Ockham and defenders of Biel and others as well are all going to say it's not really arbitrary because there still is a connection between divine will and the divine character, so it's not absolutely arbitrary. It's not like God is just this kind of despot who just randomly throws out this or that law, like he's got a reason for doing what he does. But it does divorce law from the eternal character of God. So in a more traditional view, like that is found in Thomas Aquinas, it's going to be said that the moral law is a reflection of the divine character. So why is lying wrong? Because God is the truth. Not just because God has determined it to be so. But to be fair to Ockham, it clearly is the case that there are times where God does make prohibitions based on temporal circumstances that can be changed. This is the case between the Old and New Testament. There obviously are changes to the ceremonial laws. But what someone like Thomas Aquinas is going to say, and someone in that tradition is going to say, which includes me and the tradition of general Protestant scholasticism as well, is going to be that there's a distinction between the moral law and the civil and ceremonial law, so that the moral law, these things that are morally inherently right and wrong, are a reflection of the divine character and cannot be changed. All right. For Ockham, God's freedom is kind of almost absolute. And well, as I said, people are going to try to defend him from, accusations of pure arbitrariness. He kind of sounds like that at times, at least. Ockham speaks of an individual being saved without the virtue of charity if God so ordains. And this is going to be more significant as we look at Gabriel Biel. And this is going to be part of at least what is a common critique of the Reformation, that what the Reformers essentially do is adopt Ockham's voluntarism, or his nominalism, here. And so what he's saying here is that it's not that the virtue of charity is something that is inherent to salvation, that God only could save the one who has charity, but simply that God has determined that it be the case. But if God determines that he decides to save an individual anyway without that, then he can do so. He speaks about the possibility of the remittance of guilt without the infusion of grace. So that salvation is really more determined by a divine decree and the divine determination that it is anything kind of inherent to the system of redemption itself. God accepts whatever it is that he has deemed acceptable in his ordained will, by his ordained power rather than his absolute power. That which saves, in other words, does so not because it has any intrinsic worth in itself, but because of a divine ordinance. You have to have this because of his theology of nominalism with the incarnation. So in more traditional Christian theology, it's been taught that the incarnation is actually in some way a necessity. In other words, God could not have just determined that he was going to just ignore human sin without there being any satisfaction of human sin or restoration of human nature. Like there is an essential characteristic of the incarnation and the atonement. But he's going to say this is really just an issue of divine ordination. God could have determined that he's going to save through something totally different if he decided to, or God could have just determined by his own freedom that he's just going to ignore sin and there's going to be no satisfaction for sin at all. It's not a necessity. God does not work through sacraments instrumentally. So this is part of the system as well. Everything is just by divine ordinance, or divine covenant, we might say. So it's more just by the conjunction of the giving of grace and the receiving of the sacraments by divine decree. So it's not like there is this inherent tie between sacraments and grace that is given through it, but God has simply decreed or determined that as one receives the sacraments, God will also simultaneously give grace, but not in an instrumental sense. This leads to a kind of Neo-Pelagianism, as we're going to see, at least in some of the Occamists, like Gabriel Biel, this divorce from metaphysical realism, which contends that God has chosen in this kind of decree, he has decided to reward you when you try your hardest. So we'll look at that in the next one. It can also lead to a kind of arbitrary view of predestination, though we're not going to look at Ockham's view of predestination or some of Ockham's descendants on predestination here. Gregory of Rimini would be a really interesting one to look at, though. Ockham has a strong view of human freedom, so he emphasizes divine freedom, voluntarism there, but he also does have a strong view of human freedom as well, and he believes that one can will against their own desires. So you can have a desire for something that is wrong, but your will is so strong that you can overcome those desires. Last thing here, and then we'll end. Okay, in his ethics, Ockham is in many ways really a divine command theorist. And I know that there's been some pushing back against that label to define Ockham, but I don't really know how you do that. I mean, it seems pretty rather apparent to me that that's the case. And I guess maybe it's because of the lack of arbitrariness that some argue for in Ockham, but divine command theory doesn't have to be arbitrary. Divine command theory essentially is a way of looking at ethics that would say that something is right or wrong simply because God has commanded it. And this is often set against a eudaimonistic ethic. And eudaimonism is a view of ethics that says that which is right, that which is virtuous, is necessary in order for an individual to be happy. Now, happy doesn't just mean pleasure. It's total misunderstanding of what happiness is in a classical framework. But in other words, to have a purposeful, well-ordered life, so that there is a kind of clear, purposive nature in ethics. It's not just that God has random demands that we must obey. God, of course, has demands, but instead that it is something that is inherent to our nature, that our nature is such that that which is moral or right is best for our natures. They're purposefully guided to exhibit certain virtues as we are created to be. But instead, the divine command theory merely says that God has declared something to be the case, so we have to just do it. It becomes abstract, and it does feel a bit arbitrary. Ockham doesn't deny, though, the development of virtue. So he does argue for the development of personal virtue on the basis of reason. So there's a sense of virtue. There also is some sense of natural law, at least in Ockham, that the law is connected to human nature. So there is some sense, at least, in which the law is that which is best for our natures. Though that doesn't really take primacy in the way that Ockham speaks about these things. There's at least a move away from that, the centrality of that. He does also believe in the possibility of the virtuous pagan. The pagan can be good and right and virtuous as well. We'll look at what Gabriel Biel says about that because he develops that theme a little bit more. All right. Well, thanks for watching this. I hope this gives you at least a general overview of William of Ockham and William of Ockham's ideas. I'm much more familiar with Ockham, actually, than I am with Scotus. So, and largely that's because of this is really significant for understanding what's going on in something like Martin Luther's own background in his theological training. Is you have to have some knowledge of Ockham and some knowledge of Gabriel Biel, especially to really grasp what it is that Luther is reacting against during the Reformation. So Ockham does become a very influential figure. He's very influential in this late scholastic period, but his ideas are influential beyond that. Some of his themes of logic and language really, in some ways, precede later developments in those same areas as well. And as I said, you don't have to be a nominalist to gather ideas from Ockham, and I think that there is, again, a very simplistic view of intellectual history that you're going to find from a lot of people on the internet, which wants to place people in very clear-cut categories to say things like, well, say Martin Luther was a nominalist because he got ideas from William of Ockham and therefore he's a nominalist. Well, everybody gets ideas from William of Ockham. This is the reality. People from all sides get things from William of Ockham. And it's also kind of okay to say that someone may have been wrong on this or that issue, but they also had helpful categories in this issue or that issue. And if you want to do this, one group is good, one group is bad, and this kind of thing where it's like, well, you have these set of thinkers that influence these people and these set of thinkers that influence these people. You're just not going to understand intellectual history because that's not how things work. It's never that simple. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your podcast app. We'll see you in the next one. God bless.